All right, get ready because we're taking a deep dive into the future.
Ooh, sound exciting.
Specifically, the future of human welfare in the 21st century.
Okay, I'm all ears.
And to guide us, we have this research paper by Bjorn Lomborg titled Welfare in the 21st Century.
Yeah, Lomborg always has some interesting, thought-provoking ideas.
Yeah, and this paper is no exception. It's really quite fascinating.
So what's the main takeaway? What's he saying?
Well, instead of focusing on all those, those doom and gloom predictions we hear so often.
Right, like the world's ending, everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
Exactly. He takes a more optimistic approach, you could say.
Okay, I like where this is going.
He paints this picture of potential economic growth, changes in inequality, how we use energy.
And of course, the big one, climate change, right?
Of course, that's a huge part of it.
So what's his take on all that?
Well, it's pretty nuanced, and I have to say some of it's pretty surprising.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for starters, he suggests that by 2100, the average person could be, get this, 10 times richer than today.
Whoa, 10 times. That's a pretty bold prediction.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
But hold on, wouldn't that just make inequality even worse? More money for the rich, less for everyone else.
That's what I thought too, but Lomborg actually suggests the opposite might happen.
Oh, really? How so?
He believes global inequality might actually shrink.
Shrink. Wait, you're saying the gap between the rich and poor could get smaller?
Yep, he thinks lower-income countries could grow faster than high-income ones.
That's a pretty big shift from what we usually hear.
It is. The paper even suggests that we might see a level of global equality not seen since the 1800s.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. But how does he explain this potential for growth and a reduction in inequality?
Well, he highlights access to energy as a key factor.
Energy, huh? I guess I can see how that would be important.
Yeah, it's essential for just about everything, right? Our homes, industries, transportation.
You're right, you don't really think about it, but it's the foundation for so much.
Exactly. And Lomborg points out that energy use per person has already increased 3.5 times since the 1800s.
3.5 times, that's a lot.
And he projects that it could almost double again by 2100.
Double! Wow, we're going to need a lot of power plants.
We are. But it makes you wonder, with all this energy use, particularly if we're still relying on fossil fuels.
Yeah, what about climate change? I thought renewables were the future.
That's what we hear all the time, right?
Yeah, wind, solar, all that.
But here's the thing. The paper suggests that fossil fuels might actually still be a dominant source of energy in 2100.
Really? Even with all the push for green energy?
Yeah, he says they could still provide like 77% of the world's energy by then.
Huh. That's a lot more than I would guessed.
Me too. It's pretty surprising. But it makes you think, if energy use keeps rising and fossil fuels are still in the mix, what does that mean for climate change?
Right. How does Lomborg address that?
Well, he doesn't shy away from it. He acknowledges climate change is a real problem caused by humans.
Okay, so he's not a denier or anything?
No, not at all. He says it could have significant negative impacts.
But he's not predicting, the apocalypse or anything.
He's more cautious about those kinds of extreme predictions.
Okay, so he's saying we need to be realistic, but not panic.
Yeah, something like that. He actually uses this interesting concept he calls the expanding bullseye effect.
The expanding bullseye effect, what's that?
Well, imagine a dartboard, right? The bigger the bullseye, the easier it is to hit.
Yeah, makes sense.
He's saying that as the global population grows and we create more wealth.
The bullseye for potential damage from natural disasters also gets bigger.
Exactly. So even if the severity of those disasters doesn't necessarily increase because of climate change,
the impact could still be greater just because there's more stuff in harm's way.
more people, more buildings, more infrastructure, all that.
Okay, I get it. That's an interesting way to look at it.
It is, isn't it? It's not just about how strong the storms are.
But also about what they hit.
Exactly. And Lomborg argues that we often overlook that.
So he's saying we need to be careful about just focusing on the intensity of climate events.
Yeah, we need to consider the bigger picture.
And what about our ability to adapt? Don't we get better at dealing with these things over time?
That's another point he makes. He says we often underestimate human ingenuity.
Our ability to problem solve.
Exactly. He thinks we're much more adaptable than we give ourselves credit for.
Like even with something like coastal flooding, which is a big concern with rising sea levels.
Right. He used that as a prime example.
What does he say about that?
Well, he points out that some models predict trillions of dollars in damage from coastal flooding every year.
Trillions. That's an insane amount of money.
It is, but those models make a big assumption. They assume we won't do anything to adapt.
Oh, so like we'll just sit there and let the water rise around us.
Exactly. But in reality, we build seawalls, elevate structures, even relocate entire communities.
So we're not just helpless bystanders.
No, we're problem solvers.
Mm.
And when you factor in those adaptation measures, the estimated costs of coastal flooding drop dramatically.
Dramatically. Like how much?
He says it could be as little as 0.008% of global GDP.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. It really highlights the importance uh, of human innovation.
So he's saying we shouldn't just take those doom and gloom predictions at face value.
Exactly. We need to remember that we have the capacity to protect ourselves.
And he doesn't just stop at coastal flooding, right? He looks at other disasters too.
He does. He digs into the data on droughts, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, all sorts of things.
And what's the verdict? Are these disasters really getting worse because of climate change?
His conclusion is pretty interesting. He argues that a lot of those claims of worsening disasters,
Might not be as clear-cut as they seem.
right, especially when you account for things like population growth.
And development in vulnerable areas.
Exactly. He says we need to be careful about attributing everything to climate change.
Okay, so he's not denying climate change.
But he's urging us to be more discerning about its impacts,
I see. It's about making sure we're accurately assessing the situation.
separating the signal from the noise, as they say.
Got it. So if we're maybe overestimating the impacts of climate change, what does that mean for how we deal with it? For climate policy?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And that's where things get even more interesting. But we'll have to save that for part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, I'm hooked. Can't wait to hear what he has to say about that.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to unpack more of Lomborg's thought-provoking arguments. Welcome back. We're digging into Bjorn Lomborg's welfare in the 21st century, and we were just talking about how he brings a new way of looking at the impacts of climate change, with that expanding bullseye effect.
Yeah, it's like realizing that a hurricane hitting a deserted island is way different from one hitting a big city, even if the hurricanes are the same strength.
Exactly. And it got me thinking, we hear all the time about those predictions of coastal flooding from the sea levels rising.
Right.
And Lomborg seems to be saying those predictions might not be the whole picture.
You got it. He really dives into that.
He does.
Uses coastal flooding as a prime example of where predictions can be off, especially if we don't, think about human ingenuity and stuff.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he points out that some models, the ones that assume we do nothing, zero adaptation,
Oh, wow.
predict crazy costs, like trillions of dollars every year from all that flood damage.
Trillions. Come on. That's got to be an exaggeration.
Well, that's what Lomborg thinks. He says those models basically assume we just stand there and watch the water rise.
Yeah, right. Like we're not going to do anything.
Exactly. But humans, we adapt, right? We build seawalls, we make buildings higher, we even move whole communities if we have to.
Yeah, we're pretty good at figuring things out when we need to.
That's his point. So he's saying we need to factor in our ability to solve problems, that we can protect ourselves.
I like that. That's a more hopeful way to look at it.
Right. And when you add in those adaptation measures, those more realistic models, well, the estimated costs plummet. They go down to something like 0.008% of global GDP.
Wow, that's a tiny fraction of those other numbers, those trillions we were talking about.
I know, it's a huge difference.
So he's basically saying we should be a little skeptical of those doomsday predictions.
Yeah, don't just, accept them without thinking.
We got to remember that human innovation can really make a difference in reducing that potential damage.
For sure. And he goes even further. He doesn't just stop at coastal flooding.
No.
Nope. He looks at droughts, floods, wildfires, even hurricanes. He's digging into the data, really examining it to see if those claims that disasters are getting worse, if that really holds up.
I bet that's where things get a little controversial. So what does he find? Are those disasters actually getting worse because of climate change?
Well, what he says is that a lot of those claims, when you really look at them closely and take into account things like, population growth and more development in places that are already vulnerable.
Right.
Well, they're not as clear-cut as some people make them out to be.
Oh, so it's not about denying climate change, but about making sure we're looking at it in the right way.
Exactly. It's about separating the real impacts from all the noise.
I see. Okay, so if the way we're looking at climate change needs some adjusting, what does that mean for how we try to fix it? For climate policy, I mean.
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is.
Mm.
I'm curious, what does Lomborg think we should be doing? What kind of policies does he like?
All right, so here's where it gets really interesting. He's not jumping on that bandwagon of cut emissions as fast as you can, no matter the cost. Instead, he's saying, hold on, let's be rational about this. He wants policies that minimize all the costs of the damage from climate change, and the cost of doing something about it.
Oh, so he's thinking about the big picture. He's realizing that there's going to be trade-offs. Right.
Exactly. He's not ignoring the economic and social impacts of those actions. He doesn't want to create a whole bunch of new problems while trying to fix this one.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So how does he figure out what the best approach is?
Well, he uses this model. It's called the DICE model, which stands for Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model. Kind of a
I
mouthful.
was going to say.
Anyway, he uses it to look at all these different policy options, and get this, he finds what he thinks is the optimal policy.
The optimal policy, what's that?
The one that, like, hits the sweet spot between reducing emissions and keeping costs down.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What's this magic policy?
Well, it involves limiting warming to 3.75 degrees Celsius by 2100.
3.75 degrees. Whoa, that sounds high.
I know, right? We always hear about 2 degrees or even 1.5 as being like the limit.
Yeah, like anything above that is a disaster.
Right. But Lomborg, he sees it differently.
I bet he does.
He's not saying we shouldn't reduce emissions. He's actually calling for pretty aggressive cuts. But he says trying to hit those super ambitious targets like 1.5 degrees could actually make things worse.
Brits. How?
He says it could cost so much money that it would hurt our ability to deal with other important problems.
Oh, I see.
Like, we'd be so focused on hitting this one specific target that we wouldn't have the resources to do other things that could actually make people's lives better.
So in the end, we might be worse off overall.
Exactly. He even goes so far as to criticize the Paris Agreement.
Really? The Paris Agreement? I thought that was like the gold standard for dealing with climate change.
I know, right?
Uh,
But Lomborg, he says it's not very cost effective. He estimates that for every dollar spent, we only get like 11 cents of benefit.
11 cents. That's pretty bad.
Yeah, he thinks there are better ways to spend our money if we really want to make a difference.
Wow. I'm starting to see things a little differently now. This is giving me a lot to think about.
That's Lomborg for you. He makes you question everything. But he also does something else really important.
What's that?
He reminds us that climate change isn't the only problem we're facing.
Oh, right. It's easy to forget about everything else when we're so focused on this one big issue.
I know, but he brings up all these other challenges.
Like what?
Well, remember that comparison he made between the number of deaths from climate change and from air pollution?
Yeah, that was pretty eye-opening.
Right. He estimates that climate change causes about 150,000 deaths every year.
Okay.
But air pollution, that causes like 5 million deaths a year.
Wow, that's a huge difference. It puts things into perspective.
Exactly. It shows that we need to prioritize. We got to figure out where our efforts are going to make the biggest difference.
It's like triage on a global scale.
That's a great way to put it. And Lomborg argues that focusing too much on climate change, especially those super expensive solutions, could actually take away resources from other problems that are even more urgent.
Oh, I see. So he's not saying climate change isn't important,
No, not at all.
but he's saying we need to be smart about how we approach it.
Exactly. And that's where we get to one of his most interesting points, a point that really gets to the heart of what he thinks is the best path forward.
Okay, I can't wait to hear this.
Well, we'll have to save that for part 3 of our deep dive. Things are about to get even more thought-provoking.
Ooh, the suspense.
Yeah.
Don't miss it, folks. We're about to unpack Lomborg's big picture vision for humanity. We're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Lomborg's welfare in the 21st century. It's been, a real eye-opener, to say the least.
Yeah, he always manages to, like, challenge those conventional ideas and make you think, outside the box a little.
Totally. I mean, we've gone from talking about this incredible possibility of economic growth and reducing inequality to, like, rethinking how we see climate change and, whether our policies are actually effective.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure.
It is. But remember that idea we talked about earlier about tunnel vision?
Right, about getting so focused on one problem that we forget about everything else.
Exactly. Like that comparison between deaths from climate change versus air pollution, man, that really stuck with me.
Yeah, it's a powerful illustration of how how important it is to have a balanced approach, right? To consider all the challenges, not just one.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to what I think is like one of the most fascinating parts of Lomborg's analysis.
Hmm.
He goes deep into those UN Sustainable Development Goals.
The SDGs, those 17 goals.
Yeah, those, ending poverty, promoting health and education, clean water, climate action, all that.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. They're pretty ambitious, trying to tackle like everything at once.
They are, but Lomborg doesn't shy away from examining them through that cost-benefit lens of his.
So what does he say? Do they hold up to his scrutiny?
Well, he cites this research that suggests some of those goals,
Mhm.
especially the ones focused on health and education, actually provide way more social benefits per dollar spent compared to a lot of climate policies.
Really? So like we could get more bang for our buck by investing in things like, I don't know, healthcare or schools in developing countries.
That's what he's suggesting. It's not that climate action isn't important, but he's arguing that we need to be uh, more strategic, I guess, about where we put our resources.
It's like imagine if we took, say, $1 trillion that we were going to spend on hitting a specific temperature target.
Yeah,
And instead, we invested it in things like, I don't know, reducing poverty, improving sanitation, preventing those preventable childhood deaths.
that could make a real difference in millions of people's lives, right?
Exactly. So it makes you think, where should our priorities be?
For sure. It's a tough question, but I think Lomborg's work gives us a good way to start thinking about it.
I agree. He's encouraging us to like move beyond all the emotion and the simple narratives and really look at the data, the nuances, the whole picture of what it means to make the world a better place.
Yeah, to really improve human welfare.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the message for our listeners? What should they take away from all of this?
I think Lomborg wants us to think critically, to question what we hear, and to be open to different points of view.
To not just accept the prevailing narrative without really thinking about it?
Right. He's reminding us that while climate change is serious, it's not the only problem out there, and we have to think about the trade-offs.
We have to make choices.
And he's urging us to ask ourselves, what's going to have the biggest positive impact on the most people? Where can we do the most good?
Those are powerful questions, questions we should all be asking ourselves.
Definitely. And that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Giving you the information and the tools to wrestle with these complex issues and form your own opinions.
Exactly. We don't have all the answers, but we hope to equip you to ask the right questions. So, to everyone listening out there, we leave you with this. What's the right balance for you? How do you weigh the costs and benefits? And what are you going to do to make a better future for yourself and for everyone?
Keep exploring, keep learning,
No.
and keep those questions in mind.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.